Okay, so we're back again for another episode, and tonight we're going to be discussing Foucault and postmodernism. I really have had an interest in postmodernism for a long time, mainly because my primary interest in philosophy used to be in ancient philosophy and a little bit in medieval and Renaissance philosophy. And I spent a lot of time working on ancient languages, Greek and Latin, spent a lot of time translating. And I guess as part of that experience, I sort of developed this actual kind of feeling like I really wanted at some level to emerge from all of that and explore the world of contemporary philosophy a little bit. I guess, at one point I sort of felt like I was somewhere in a library in which I had kind of buried myself many, many floors below the actual level where I was, kind of in a cave somewhere doing this translating that I wondered would ever actually communicate anything to many people. And I guess, when I finally ended that period and I started looking into postmodernism a little bit, I wasn't really looking at it through the lens or from the standpoint of all the political stuff that's out there that's been said about postmodernism. But I actually just embraced the entire phenomenon from the standpoint of, this was what was happening in the 80s and 90s, and I'm really excited to learn about this. I would really like to understand what was going on during that time period and look into this world of philosophy as it was developing in those years, just as a matter of pure curiosity. And I really did find it interesting. I think my curiosity and open mindedness about the whole thing really was rewarded with a few really good books that I happened to come upon. One was by a guy named Hans Bertens, Bertens, which I believe was just entitled Postmodernism. It was a survey of all the art, the movements in art that were going on at the time, movements in theater. And it took up the topic of postmodernism, not just from a narrow philosophical perspective, but from the standpoint of a cultural movement, which I think is really the right way to look at it. We're into Foucault right now, and Foucault does something very similar. He gets out of the narrow academic confines of whatever specific issues are being discussed, issues having to do with technicalities, with philosophy of language and modality and philosophy of logic and all that sort of thing, and embraces a global kind of view of society and culture and cultural trends and tries to understand the world as it presents itself to us. And that is definitely something that is not easy to do. It's not the safe route to take, probably, if you're an academic out there and you're trying to make a name for yourself, you're trying to stay employed, you want to write some articles that can get published and get yourself established. And going out on a limb and trying to be a cultural theorist might be a way to end your career if you can't quite get it right. But what I think, my own journey in reading these kinds of books and just engaging with things that I'm really curious about is, the more that you read through them, I think the more you start to get a sense that it really is important at a certain point to try to develop a view of the society you are living in contemporary terms that speaks to other people. It's a project that is not easy. It's not easy to develop a unique, new viewpoint of the world that is truly illuminating and kind of puts it all together in a way that makes sense from a theoretical standpoint that's also engaging. But at its core, this is a necessary part of what philosophy has always been about. Maybe the number of philosophers through the history of philosophy who have not been academic philosophers, who have actually made great contributions to philosophy, coming from people outside the academic world. Maybe it has something to do with just the fact that they were open to pursuing that path. It's something that you probably couldn't publish reliably on for a while, but it's something that kind of has to develop for a while. So, without too much more preamble, the text I've chosen for tonight is called Truth and Power, and I came up with the idea of finally discussing Foucault's relationship to postmodernism based upon this text. And he's discussing truth and power, but he's also discussing a few interesting cultural trends. What Foucault does in his books on civilization, the development of Western civilization, through the period that we call modernity, is he puts the pieces together for exactly how society develops into a new way of governing. And the term governmentality is a term that Foucault invents to try to describe it. What it involves is the progressive reach of power further and further into people's daily lives as the apparatus of the state begins to expand itself in the form of more policing, more restrictions, more laws, more regulations, and more emphasis on different types of discipline involving the body that begin in places like the school system, that get translated into the work environment later on in life, the factory floor, the way that certain architectural schemes were developed to be able to observe people at all times. That whole theme of surveillance as a way of creating a different sort of power, as a way of bringing in to being a new kind of discipline within individuals. Individuals end up having to police themselves in ways in order not to be seen as not conforming to society in certain ways that would damage them. And the whole surveillance model is probably the best way to try to understand how all of that comes about. That's the political, social side of philosophy, or rather of society, that Foucault tracks in a lot of his books. But in this particular article, he ends up discussing things like the disappearance of the writer toward the end of the interview. And it's a nice way to get into exactly what the postmodern moment is, as you might be able to experience it in Foucault. And what it really amounts to is a movement from a global conception or a meta conception of things like ideologies guiding people's behavior, guiding people's beliefs on a real macro scale, like the ideology of communism as like a worldview that's all embracing and all encompassing that you can buy into, that will shape your behavior and give you a sense of what history should be like, the way it should unfold, a sense of destiny and purpose. That's the same kind of global meta narrative, you might say, that traditional religions have tried to take advantage of, or that they have tried to create. And what we see through the progress of the 20th century, and I guess extending back into the 19th century, is the progressive loss of faith in these grand narratives. And what happens over this period of time, through the period of modernity, is, in the way that Jean-Francois Lyotard puts it in his essay, The Postmodern Condition, is that there is a growing skepticism about the viability of these meta-narratives. And the picture that Foucault paints is that not only does knowledge and the truth that's associated with it and the power that tries to utilize the truth and knowledge regimes, not only do they become less global and all-encompassing, but they in turn become more and more localized. And Foucault's idea of what power really is as we experience it in, closer to our contemporary society, is not as something that's all embracing or something that's all around us, like an all encompassing idea that we can either accept or reject. But it's really something that is fluid, something that could be described as involving links in a chain that have to be kept in order, that have to be kept viable. There has to be a certain sort of continuity between the different nodes of power that exist in political organizations or businesses, corporations, whatever. Anything you can think of that involves a system of power is going to involve a series of links in a chain that have to have a continuity between them. So power isn't this sort of metaphysical idea anymore. In Foucault, it becomes something very concrete. It becomes something related to technology. So it's no longer related to knowledge as something ideological, but it's now related to knowledge as something technical and instrumental. So the development of modernity involves kind of a spiritual shift as we move into more of a technological society. The spiritual shift being away from huge ideas that try to put the world into a certain perspective and get people marching under a certain banner, to power and truth localized within certain types of technological knowledge. So if I were teaching a class, I would definitely ask whether everyone agrees with that. Whether anybody can actually come up with any counterexamples to that. And there might be a few people who would say, well, what about capitalism? Communism has kind of faded away. A lot of people believe in capitalism, but the pushback there would be, well, how much faith do we really have in capitalism? And what does capitalism mean to people in their local situation? What sort of power relationships does it take to keep a capitalist society moving, and how do we experience them? is there something that can be said for the links in the chain idea? Well, it seems to me, and this is going beyond Foucault's texts, my interpret to just apply the ideas for a minute. But it seems to me that the most influential person, the person with the greatest power in the life of the average person, is somebody's boss, and they have a power relationship with somebody further up in the company, and there it's ultimately goes back to whoever founded the company. And really, the kind of knowledge that is being utilized in that situation is not some kind of ideology that people can carry a banner, as they ride away into battle somewhere, but it's a technological kind of knowledge. And I'm not sure that anybody is actually out there with a huge banner that says capitalism on it. Although the idea is kind of out there, it is kind of operative as a useful idea, especially for the people who've created businesses and such. But I'm not sure that it's something that everyone really necessarily agrees with, right down to all of its essentials as it impacts their daily lives. So that might be a way of applying the idea. Other meta-narratives I can think of would be religion, communism. Those sorts of things are certainly being questioned. And they don't have the force in people's lives that meta-narratives of that sort would have had years ago. The kind of force that gets people united and galvanized, creates real united action toward a particular goal. Instead, that kind of united, galvanized action can occur more at a local level and maybe even at the hyper-local level among groups of like-minded people who are getting together for a particular purpose. But when they do so, they usually don't appeal to grand narratives. They might have a particular idea like social justice, but the idea of social justice itself doesn't produce any sort of dogmatism about the sorts of things that you're supposed to say or do. And, an ideology basically is what I'm trying to say, that, brings the group together as opposed to the group getting together to work towards some concrete goals. So the way that this relates to postmodernism, again, is the shift from the global ideological toward the more local. And for Foucault, it's definitely linked to the idea of truth, not as something that's a regulative idea that's regulating knowledge. That would be the classical view. Truth regulates knowledge. At the end of the day, if it's not true, it can't count as knowledge. But in Foucault's picture, it's actually forms of knowledge making use of truth as we find it. And above knowledge, you have the idea of power as the regulative governing idea that you could think of as kind of standing over and above these different forms of knowledge, which are themselves really forms of discourse that are making use of truth as we find it, which can really be reduced to sets of facts, sets of ideas that relate the facts together and put them together. And in certain situations, the facts and the relationships between facts become ways of organizing people to do productive things in the service of power. And that's really kind of a description of how modernity develops, developing toward the local, developing away from those old grand ideas, those philosophical ideas that used to have so much importance to people. We're kind of getting away from that. So let me come back to the writer for a second. Because the writer is an instance of this, and Foucault thinks that the writer is the last person who had the role of being an intellectual in society. The writers he has in mind, I think, are writers that are people from the 50s and 60s. But the great classic writers that we think of as having an important impact on helping us understand the world around us as we experience it for ourselves in our daily lives, and help us create a picture of that, so that they stand as real kinds of social criticism. Go back to people you can go back before the 50s to people like Steinbeck and Faulkner, Hemingway, a lot of existential themes in his work. These writers served a social function that was kind of the last evolution. They were kind of the last people in line to serve that role as people who created a grand, encompassing vision. And what came after them? Well, Foucault says we end up with the disappearance of the writer, and with the disappearance of the writer, we actually just get further and further into a technological society. And I think this would be a good point to bring in a few quotes just for purposes of illustration. So I'm reading this out of the Foucault Reader, which was edited by Paul Rabinowitz. And this is from page 64 of Truth and Power. So Foucault, and this is an interview, and he's responding. He says, "I would say that the state consists in the codification of a whole number of power relations, which render its functioning possible, and that revolution is a different type of codification of the same relations. This implies that there are many different kinds of revolution, roughly speaking, as many kinds as there are possible subversive recodifications of power relations, and further, that one can perfectly well conceive of revolutions which leave essentially untouched the power relations which form the basis for the functioning of the state." Okay, so I'm going to fit that quote, which has a lot of important ideas in it, into the idea of the localization of knowledge, truth, and power. And just notice that he says, revolutions don't have to be thought of as being carried out, in such a way that people are actually overthrowing an entire state apparatus. They can be thought of as being carried out at a more local level. And when you have a revolution in a way of producing a particular product, let's just say that, for example, the way that occurs is not by people, chipping away at the kind of, basic day-to-day structures and the way that things are done, improving this, modifying that, making this thing more efficient, making this line of work more integrated, etc. It comes through people questioning that local system itself. So it kind of relates back to Foucault's way of talking about Kant's picture of the way that the individual, the modern individual in the enlightened society, can relate himself to society as a whole. So in your private capacity as an individual, you do your duty as a father, a worker, a priest, a teacher, or whatever you might be. But you are also free in an enlightened society, in the ideal society, to go out and question the way things are done as much as you want. So it's a way of being both in society and at the same time outside of society. It's a way of being part of the organization, part of the integration, part of the efficiency of whatever, corporation, group, business you're a part of. And at the same time, being able to use your reason to stand outside of it and question the rationality of it. And it's through standing outside and using your rationality that these revolutions occur. And this is somewhat like the picture that Foucault is painting in this particular quote. So it's definitely not by making systems more efficient over time that revolutions occur. Revolutions occur with, let's say, questioning outside the scope of the way things are being carried out. So what I would relate that to, and I think it is an important idea. It's important enough to just kind of contemplate it for just a moment. One of the important ways that could be applied to philosophy, and whether philosophy really can do something to change the world, is just to think of philosophy as being engaged in that particular way. And maybe one of the ways in which contemporary social movements are kind of missing things a little bit is by maybe not utilizing a philosophical approach in a way that might help to revolutionize things in a positive way. So what I mean is, we encounter things on social media like cultural appropriation, for example. It's just the thing that comes to mind first. And a lot of people out there will find an example of somebody who wore something that they feel was inappropriate. But I think, for as much as those people are passionate about pointing out these particular things that they find to be wrong in society, it's somewhat similar to being in an organization and working to work out the kinks, improve things so that things function more smoothly. That's a very different thing from taking a look at the organization itself, the way things are being done, and rethinking things in a way that is outside the system of the way things work. And that's the kind of thinking that you really need. There's something broader, perhaps, than the idea of cultural appropriation that needs to be considered as a way of thinking about society. That's not easy to develop. It involves needing to develop a perspective on society itself in order to use that critical discourse in a way that is more revolutionary. And that requires some philosophical acumen. I think it requires looking at history, for one thing, because you can't really understand where we are today without understanding the events that lead up to it. And I know that that's kind of an old saw. Probably every history teacher in high school has ever said that. But in order to understand events within some sort of framework and some sort of context, it requires a certain understanding of a continuity of things, how one thing led to another, that allows you to develop that perspective. So I think what Foucault has in mind here, what Kant has in mind here, can be applied with some profit to what people are trying to do these days. And maybe just ask whether, when somebody is objecting to something somebody wore, something like that, think about if there are any broader issues, that can be brought in that are actually more revolutionary. Are we doing something that is going to really change society, or are we just doing things in a way that just sort of amounts to working out the kinks in the production line, the functioning of society in the day-to-day? So just something to think about, tools that we can take from these texts. Okay, so let me return to the writer again. I think I got a little bit off track there. So the writer is the last person to really enunciate these global perspectives. He's the person who develops that perspective of society that allows people to understand themselves in relation to what's being presented in the work, in the novel. And Foucault says that with the disappearance of the writer, we have the last link in that chain of people who did that sort of thinking. That figure is disappearing in modern society, and it's being overtaken by technological kinds of power. And that really describes where we are in this postmodern era. Highly localized. We don't have a faith in grand narratives the way that we used to. And more we experience power as something localized, and truth more and more at the service of people who are trying to utilize it for a particular end, rather than something that can set us free or something that can revolutionize the way that we do things. Before moving on to my next point, I'd just like to point out that I think it is a very useful and fruitful exercise to go back and look at films that are considered to be modernist films, and just notice that in these films there is always this grasping for the eternal. There's this yearning for something that stands above us, that can stand as an idea that helps everything make sense. Maybe it's just a particular kind of symbol, that gives us hope and direction and gives our lives meaning. And just notice that in the history of cinema, there is a certain point at which these modernist films give way to films that focus more on people's daily lives and the experience that they have in their daily lives. And in a lot of cases, the narratives themselves become more and more discontinuous, and sometimes the whole idea of rationality itself is broken up into different fragments so that there isn't even, one continuous framework that can be applied to understand the film. And in that way, you could kind of think of the postmodern film as mirroring the postmodern condition. So the idea I have that I want to suggest as my own contribution to this discussion is that if what the postmodern condition amounts to, taking into account everything that Foucault is saying, that he's tried to show, if what the postmodern condition amounts to is, on the one hand, a lack of faith in meta-narratives, and on the other, truth as something that's at the service of knowledge, which is in turn at the service of power, maybe the way to subvert that paradigm in our local situations, if we're in a situation where we want to change things, is to try to use truth against power. So power ultimately wants to make use of truth. Is there a way that we can recapture truth for our own purposes? And I'm just going to speak in such a way that I'm just going to say, assuming that the people who are making use of truth have the right sort of intentions and that sort of thing, that they want to make a positive change in society. Maybe the thing to do, the most subversive thing that you can do, is reclaim the notion of truth. So if truth is really just something people are making use of and not something that can stand on its own, then truth has no independent power of itself outside some sort of regime of power, which is the way that Foucault puts the matter. But I think that idea can be questioned. And I have a suspicion that Habermas is maybe gesturing towards something like the idea that I'm enunciating right now, which is that if you want to change society, maybe the way to do it is to recover the revolutionary power of truth, which is an Enlightenment idea, which in fact goes back to Kant, which is where it seems like the tension between Foucault and Kant really exists. So the difficulty with that would be that in our postmodern society, people do have skepticism about truth as being anything that really can be applied, beyond a particular framework. People have become more and more relativistically minded. One of the classic postmodern discussions is the idea of cultural relativism, the idea that comes from anthropology, that as an anthropologist, you shouldn't bring your own cultural values into the evaluation of someone else's culture, but you should bracket those and check them at the door. But for a lot of people, what that means is that there are no values that we have that we can stand on to say that another culture really shouldn't be doing a particular thing. And if you push that in a certain direction, it ends up meaning that we cannot condemn the values of a society that might be doing something that is actually quite immoral. And if you embrace that idea, then you really, really are a relativist. You really don't think that there is any such thing as a right or wrong. But you have to think about things like, if it's really just a matter of perspective, or if it's really just a matter of cultural training, that cultural conditioning, that it's all the same thing as to whether apartheid exists in South Africa or not. Or really just a matter of perspective or cultural conditioning, whether Nelson Mandela should be in prison or whether he should be free. And when you push it far enough, I think, I do believe when you push it far enough that you really are called upon to take a stand somewhere. That you can't just be a relativist, be an all-out relativist, but that's probably a discussion for another time. But what I want to suggest tonight is just that insofar as one regime of power is making use of truth for its own ends, reclaiming truth could amount to simply trying to envision another way that the same accepted sets of truths can be used for other purposes that might actually be more beneficial than the current state of affairs. So in that sense, I think the project of reclaiming truth is a viable option and might be a good social strategy for change. So with that, I'm going to call it a night.